and I'm just going to launch right into it because it's 20 minutes. And what has happened during the pandemic is most certainly a monetary event, but you need to have a crash course in certain aspects of the monetary system that are not accessible and are not known certainly by even intelligent lay people or even in a lot of cases by bankers themselves. But what happened, I'm going to give you a preview of the evidence and then I'm going to get into the evidence itself. But what has happened is that in March of 2020, the Federal Reserve, which is the U.S. central bank, began a course of action that radically broke from a century-old monetary pattern. And the Fed's new course of action at that time was to use its power to create wholesale or public money so as to directly affect the retail or private money supply. Don't worry if you don't understand that right now. I'm going to give you a crash course, as I said, and walk you through it so you can understand and see what is happening during the pandemic at the behest and at the instigation of the Fed, all very deliberate things. But once the pandemic started and once the Fed began adding more and more money, wholesale money to its balance sheet, the Fed added $3 trillion in wholesale money. It basically doubled its balance sheet within the space of a few weeks. And that in turn caused the mirrored image creation of $3 trillion in retail money. And retail money is money that you and I and people watching this symposium use. But as it turns out, the Fed's new course of action that it began back in March 2020 was pursuant to a plan devised by BlackRock and presented to the Fed and to indeed all central banks around the world in August of 2019. And so this was basically a foreordained response to a crisis. And we'll look at the BlackRock plan and you can see that. But BlackRock advised the Fed to implement its unprecedented plan. And unprecedented is BlackRock's word when the next economic downturn hit. In fact, that's the title of BlackRock's paper, is the next economic downturn. And as fate would have it, that downturn actually began in September of 2019 in New York in what's called the repo market. And it got a lot worse during the pandemic, but it most certainly started in September of 2019. And BlackRock presented this plan at a meeting in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, hosted by the Federal Reserve and attended by all the central banks around the world and all the monetary and financial bigwigs around the world. And BlackRock presented this plan, and it called its plan for creating central bank money and somehow getting the central bank money or public money into private hands. BlackRock called this plan going direct. Now, since the Fed implemented the BlackRock's going direct plan starting in March 2020, it has left a monetary record behind. And when you examine this monetary record, you could see very clearly that the Fed was definitely and without question following BlackRock's going direct plan to the letter. And by way of that background, I now want to go to a clip from a guy named Augustin Carstens. Augustin Carstens is the general manager of the Bank for International Settlements. And he is going to talk basically about central bank digital currencies in a short clip here. It's less than a minute long. And central bank digital currencies is where we are headed. That's sort of the third step. The second step is what I'm largely going to talk about today. But I want you to know where we are heading with all of this and what all of this means. So I'm going to cut to the chase and show you where we end up. And keep in mind, this is from the head of the Bank for International Settlements. The BIS is the central bank of central banks. So all central banks around the world are part of the BIS, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank, so on and so forth. Here is Carstens. Listen to what he says about central bank digital currencies, because this is where we're going.
Now, in all our analysis on CBDC, in particular for the use of general use, we tend to establish the equivalence with cash. And there is a huge difference there. For example, in cash, we don't know, for example, who's using a $100 bill today. We don't know who is using a 1,000 peso bill today. A key difference with the CBDC is that central bank will have absolute control on the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability. And also, we will have the technology to enforce that.
Well, there you heard it right from the horse's mouth. Absolute control over the monetary system by central banks. So they're trying to control every dollar that you spend and decide whether the purchase you want to make with your electronic money, because they don't like cash, is going to go through or it's not. And that's where we're going. Now, to understand where we are and to understand where we've been, you need to understand something about the monetary system, and it's not well known, as I said. And this is the split circuit monetary system. The split circuit monetary system is in place throughout the world, basically everywhere in the world, except with precious few exceptions. Every country, every major jurisdiction has a split circuit monetary system. And so to be clear about this, circuit implies electronics, because as you just heard, the central bankers do not like cash. So we are excluding cash from this discussion, and we are focused on electronic bank money or electronic money in general. But that money exists in a split circuit. What do I mean by that? A split circuit, it actually means, just what I said, it's two circuits. It's really split in half. One circuit is the private circuit, and one circuit is the public circuit. That's the other circuit. Those are two circuits. The private circuit is the retail circuit, and the public circuit is the wholesale circuit. Private and public, as we are going to see, refers to who is issuing money in the respective circuits. And so let's start with the private circuit, because that's the circuit we use, the retail monetary circuit. Who is in a circuit? As I said, the issuer of money in the private circuit is commercial banks. Commercial banks create money and lend it into existence. So they create money out of thin air when they make loans, and then that money gets circulated among a circuit of of commercial bank money users, who ultimately, the borrowers pay the money back. Now, for a long time, for basically a century, economists actually argued about whether commercial banks could create money out of thin air. And that debate about whether they could do that was definitively resolved in 2014 in a brilliant paper, and I don't use that term, I use it very sparingly, a brilliant paper by one of the participants here today, Professor Richard Werner, in a 2014 paper called Can Banks Individually Create Money Out of Nothing, in which Werner undoubtedly and beyond a shadow of a doubt proves that commercial banks create money out of nothing. I was so impressed by this paper when I discovered it in 2018 that I made a video about it for my YouTube channel. I called it Mommy, Where Does Money Come From? You are looking right now at a screenshot of that video, and you can see that video on my YouTube channel, Best Evidence. I dumbed that paper down quite a bit to the consternation of the paper's author, as it turned out, based on subsequent emails. But you can review the paper or look at the video and see that commercial banks create money out of thin air. That's beyond dispute now, thanks to Professor Werner. So who is using the commercial bank money circuit? In basic terms, the users of the commercial bank monetary circuit, the retail monetary circuit, are non-bank entities and people like you and me, to finish off the circuit with a cheesy gloss there. But that's basically who uses the commercial bank, the retail money circuit. So if you have an account at Bank of America, which I don't, or HSBC or Barclays, that's all commercial bank money. That money is created out of thin air by those banks. And the team color for the private money circuit, the commercial bank money circuit here, is green. That's the private circuit. And I chose that color because money in the U.S., at least, is green. Now let's look at the public circuit. And this refers to, of course, the fact that the issuer of money in the public circuit, at least in the official version of the story, is a public entity known as the Federal Reserve. The Board of Governors is certainly a public entity. The issuer of money in the Fed is the regional circuits. They're not public, but that's neither here nor there. It's public money. The power to create money in the U.S. is sourced in the Constitution. It is a public right. It's a public good. But the Federal Reserve issues its own money. And the money is in dollars, just like the retail money in the U.S. But the users of the Federal Reserve money, the wholesale money circuit, are different. They include other central banks like the European Central Bank and the Bank of Japan and the Bank of England and Royal Bank of Australia and so on and so forth. That is one class of users. Another class of users of Federal Reserve, the public money, includes the U.S. government, including, most importantly, the U.S. Treasury. And the third and final class of users of the wholesale monetary circuit are commercial banks. They're shown here in green, but this time they have a rectangle around them because they are not the issuer of money, like the Federal Reserve with the circle around it. They are a user of money. All of these entities in the public money bank circuit, in the wholesale monetary circuit, transact in public money, in the wholesale money. And so that's the public circuit. And when we look at these two circuits, the private circuit and the public circuit, they are both in dollars. Everything is denominated in dollars, but the money is referred to differently. In the private circuit, I'm going to talk about bank money since it issues from banks. And in the public circuit, I'm going to talk about reserves because that is what the Federal Reserve creates out of nothing. It is reserves. But you cannot spend reserves. I can't spend reserves. We do not have accounts at the Fed. We can only transact in bank money. And so let's look at, let's start with bank money and get a feel for how much money we are talking about. I have a graph here I'm going to fill in a minute of bank money in the U.S. since 2003, so it covers almost 20 years. It's in trillions of dollars. That maxes out at 20 trillion. But if you look at the history of bank money in the U.S., you can see up until the time of the pandemic that it is a very linear process. It increases linearly as banks lend more and more money and create more and more money. The money goes up. So it starts at $5 trillion in 2003, tops out at about $13 trillion in 2013, and then the pandemic hits, and then things change. But we'll get to that in a minute. But that's bank money. I'm also going to talk about, let's take a look at reserves in our system. Reserves are also in trillions of dollars. So the scale of money here is the same, but there isn't as many reserves in the system as there is bank money. Let's just look at reserves and the graph of it. And you can see that it increases, it basically starts at zero and remains at zero until the middle of the financial crisis. By the way, the gray bars, there are two gray bars in this chart. The big gray bar is the global financial crisis of 2008. It lasted for something like 18 months. The skinny gray bar, the Fed tells us, is the recession that was occasioned by the pandemic. Supposedly, it only lasted 2 months. So there you have it. That's the official version. But you can see, looking at the graph of reserves in blue there, that reserves increased massively from basically zero. It wasn't zero. It was $30 to $40 billion. It was 0.03 to 0.04 trillion dollars. It increased massively during the global financial crisis of 2008, because what the Fed was doing was creating trillions of dollars of reserves at that time, and it was using those new reserves to buy assets from commercial banks in the wholesale monetary circuit. And you can see when despite the fact that the Fed started to create and then kept creating more and more reserves beginning in 2008, that blue line really has no effect on the green line. That despite the creation of all these trillions of dollars in reserves, it doesn't really affect the green line at all. It doesn't affect the retail money supply at all. And you can see that when I move the blue line up, even in the middle of the global financial crisis, when the Fed puts the pedal to the metal and starts creating trillions of dollars of reserves, it really has little to no impact on the retail monetary circuit. And I'm going to move it up again so that the lines basically come together at the beginning of the pandemic. But you can see from the green line that that's essentially a linear relationship, that it doesn't deviate from the line, the retail money supply. You know, our money supply does never deviated from the line. And that's really the key takeaway here, because once the pandemic starts and once the Fed gets going to town here, that relationship, which goes on for 100 years, the retail money supply being impervious to changes in reserves, changes overnight. And so let's look at what happens when the pandemic starts and the Fed starts packing trillions more onto its balance sheet. So let's complete the graph of reserves. And there you can see the Fed really ramps up reserves. It adds $3 to $4 trillion of reserves. It's really $3 trillion through the gray bar, through the pandemic. That's one hump, and then there's a longer extension there. It's about another $1 trillion. So that the Fed's balance sheet is now sitting at over $8 trillion, but $2 trillion of that is cash. So it's sitting at about $6 trillion right now. Now, if the old relationship between reserve money on the one hand and the green and the green commercial bank money, on the other hand, were to have obtained, that green line would just keep on trucking it. The line would just go to the very end, but it doesn't. What happens is suddenly the retail money supply begins tracking the central bank money supply. And that is a radical departure from what had happened basically the prior 100 years. I want to zoom into this, and I'm going to have to get my head out of the way so you can see it. There you go. But that is what's going on. And you can see that when the pandemic hits, for every dollar of reserves that the Fed adds to its balance sheet, the retail bank money supply goes up by $1 as well. And that's what's new. That was a radical departure, as I say, from what had happened previously. And that was not an accident. As it turns out, that was pursuant to a plan issued by BlackRock in Jackson Hole, as I mentioned. And the plan by BlackRock is called Dealing with the Next Downturn. So they're expressly contemplating another economic downturn. And they're contemplating it in August of 2019 when this paper came out and when BlackRock presented this paper to the Fed. So the premise of this paper is there's going to be another downturn, and BlackRock is offering the Fed and offering central banks advice on how to deal with the next downturn. And so what's BlackRock's advice? Well, let's go down to the next page. Take a look at the first bullet point there, cut to the chase. There is not enough monetary policy space to deal with the next downturn. Basically meaning forget the notion of creating reserves to buy assets from commercial banks. You're going to need to step it up at a reserve. You need to do something else. And so what are they going to do? The current policy space for global central banks is limited and will not be enough to respond to a significant, let alone a dramatic downturn. Okay, so the old way of doing things isn't going to work. You need to do things differently. And what do they say? Look at the fourth bullet point down there. An unprecedented response is needed, says BlackRock. What is that response? Here you go. BlackRock says that response will likely involve going direct. Those are BlackRock's words. That's their plan. They're going to go direct now. What does going direct mean? Going direct means the central bank finding ways to get central bank money, meaning you got to find a way to get that blue line to have an influence on the retail bank money circuit. You have to find a way to get central bank money issued by the Federal Reserve directly into the hands of public and private sector spenders. And that is exactly what we are seeing in this graph right here. And again, I'm going to zoom into that graph and cut my head out of the way. And you can see the public money in blue being matched dollar for dollar in green. And I wrote the paper, The Going Direct Reset, for Catherine and for Solari, and it explains how the Fed did that. But for present purposes, all you need to know is that is exactly BlackRock's plan. You just saw it in the BlackRock presentation from August of 2019. They say we need to find a way to get that public blue money into the green money circuit, and there you see it happening. Now, to put some context on this, that is BlackRock's in terms of time. BlackRock's Going Direct paper was presented on August 22nd of 2019, and they contemplate a next downturn. Notice that when BlackRock presents this plan, a few days later, maybe a couple weeks later, the Fed's that blue line has been declining for a while. It's been declining for about 18 months. Reserves have been declining. Suddenly, they start to tick up quite a bit. And the reason for that is that the crisis that BlackRock expressly contemplated began. And it started in the repo market on September 17th, 2019. The New York Fed comes in and begins adding adding reserves to the repo market. That continues for a few months, and that goes on until the pandemic hits in earnest and the Fed begins really packing money onto its balance sheet. And then, that's what is going on. But make no mistake about it, the Fed here is implementing BlackRock's plan almost to perfection. And so that is really that. And that is really why I say the pandemic is completely a monetary event. It is not really, I don't consider it a scientific event, a health event. It is a monetary event in the transition, ultimately, to get more and more central bank control. Like Carstens was talking about, we want to control all money. What you just saw here with the central bank going direct plan issued by BlackRock, that was an important step. It broke with 100 years of prior monetary history by the Fed and indeed by all central banks. And this is where we are. But the pandemic is a monetary event. And with that, that kind of concludes my presentation.
So there's several concerns, Taylor, that we have. And we have to first look at what is happening with the going direct plan. And that is very simply, we have used a health crisis as an excuse to shut down the small business and many parts of the economy. At the same time, the central bankers are printing money in a way that the people who get that money can turn around and buy assets cheap. Think of this as disaster capitalism in a way that's unprecedented. So you shut down Main Street's economy and proceed to force everybody into the stocks and the companies you own. So we are watching a dramatic increase in inequality because basically this is a leverage buyout by the people who I would say own the central banks and the top 1% of society. So this is engineered inequality, and we've experienced engineered inequality for quite a while. Now, what is the danger? If you combine vaccine passports, which is really a way of getting a digital ID card that can dovetail with the CBDC system, what we're talking about is a complete digital control system. It's the end of currencies as we know it on the retail level. And what it means is that if the central bankers, as Mr. Carstens explained to you, don't want you spending money more than 5 kilometers from your home, or they don't want you buying pizza, you can't do it. They have complete control of how you can transact. Now, why is this important? One of the reasons it's important is for over a century in the Western world, in the G7, we've had a balance of power between the central banks and the electorate. The electorate votes for the legislatures who determine fiscal policy, and the central banks basically determine monetary policy, and there's a balance of power. What we're looking now is a debt entrapment of the sovereign governments and the central bankers taking control of the treasuries through the back door, including through the debt, and an end of democracy and any representation by the electorates. If we use CBDCs, then the central bank can simply take taxes from our accounts. So we know that the World Economic Forum has said it's 2030, you have no assets and you'll be happy. What you have no assets means is if we have a digital control system, we can in fact take all your assets. The governments, Taylor, no longer have information sovereignty or financial sovereignty. So if you're the president of the United States, you're deeply dependent on the central banks to buy your treasuries and continue the financing of the operation, unless you decide to issue currency yourself, which politically you're not currently in a position to do. So you're highly dependent on the banks, and then you're highly dependent on the owners of the media and the people who are getting fantastically wealthy. If you look at the going direct reset as a plan to centralize control, it's phenomenally successful. So from their vantage point, it's working. The other problem you have if you're a government leader is you don't have information sovereignty. You can't get on the telephone and make a call without the intelligence agencies and a variety of other people, having the data and knowing what you're doing. So the government officials are very much in a corner politically, and they don't have the population's support to take the actions they need to get out of this trap. And in part, it's, as we heard in the last session, the populations really believe, or enough of people in the populations believe, that there really is a pandemic as a healthcare crisis instead of essentially a coup d'etat. So we're dealing with healthcare tyranny and financial tyranny, and to understand them both and to reverse them, we need to integrate our understanding of both together. But we also need more people in the population to understand that if you look at where they're going together, they're going into a central control, which is the end of democracies in the West as we know it, and a world where I would describe, if you look at where Carson's wants to take us, we will be slaves.
Thank you, Taylor. I really appreciate it. Great to be with you all. I'm going to try and raise the horizon just a little bit as we talk about technocracy. And there's not a lot I can add to the particulars that have already been presented. It's great stuff. I agree with Mark that just being able to kind of interact and hear these things, just fantastic, make new connections and so on. But I want to go back to, just slide back into the 1930s just briefly to point out that this is where the concept of technocracy was really crystallized. It was active before that, but it really kind of came together in the early 1930s during the heat of the Great Depression. A group of scientists and engineers at that time believed, mostly at Columbia University, believed that capitalism was dead and that it was up to them to create a brand new economic system. And they did. They called it technocracy by name. I'm not going to go through all the history on that, just to document this is a historical fact. It's there. There's plenty of information out there on it. I documented a lot of it in my books on technocracy, by the way, which are pretty much available in bookstores around the world. But over the course of years, the marketing name for technocracy has changed, and the people that have handled it have changed as well. There was no institutional support back then in the 30s for it. There is today. There's lots of big money following after this concept of technocracy. It is the only replacement economic system the world has ever known. I'd like to be challenged on this, but I've never found another one personally that was built from scratch. It's a resource-based economic system. It's not price-based. It's not supply and demand-based. But it's very technical and it's very specific, that it's going to be based on, mostly accounted for on the use of energy instead of money. This is an otherworldly type of an economic system, and I've been tracking it for 45 years now through the auspices of globalization. But as the marketing names have changed, the ones you might be familiar with today are things like sustainable development, like green economy, like the Green New Deal. Natural capitalism is another term I've heard floated around. But the major concept is in sustainable development, which is promoted, of course, by the United Nations. And sustainable development is a resource-based economic system like technocracy. We could call it neo-technocracy today just for the sake of distinction between the time periods. But the markers of the two systems are very similar. There's very little has changed over the last decades. And this group of actors has continued kind of below the surface, slipped into society to get into a position of control. And they have now been successful at doing that. And when I say another column of actors, I'm talking about the technocrats who believe that science is the only way to control everything in society, that all other systems of thought, philosophy, religion, etc., is of no repute to them. If it can't be demonstrated by science, they don't want to have anything to do with it. In the 1930s, technocracy was defined very succinctly as the science of social engineering. And it stated that it wanted to control the production and distribution of goods to the entire population, everyone in the population. They also wanted to say that there's no place for politics in technocracy. They wanted to get rid of the politicians. They wanted to get rid of the finance and financiers and so on as they do it back then. And so it was very antithetic towards government per se. We see this working into society today where many of the big tech conglomerates now are more powerful than many countries are. And countries are now bowing to them rather than the other way around. I would point out that Christiana Figueres, who is the former head of the climate change effort at the United Nations, she was the one that organized and hosted the Paris Climate Change Agreement convention. She said in a press conference shortly thereafter, this was documented in Europe as well as by, for instance, Forbes magazine and several places in the media, She said, this is the first time in the history of mankind that we are setting ourselves the task of intentionally, within a defined period of time, to change the economic development model that has been reigning for at least 150 years since the Industrial Revolution. This was really the first admission by the United Nations that they had a marker, they had a target on the back of free market economics and capitalism throughout the world. She mentioned they have a timeline, that they have an agenda, that they have an intention to do this. This is not just a conspiracy theory. This is what Christiana Figueres said. And since then, I have been watching very carefully to see for the signs of when this timeline would be activated. When would this all kind of come to pass? And now we see, for instance, the World Economic Forum talks about the Great Reset. They talk about building back better. The concept of building back better is based on the idea, the thought that everything has been wiped out. There's been some scorched earth policy, the house burned down or whatever, and you're going to reconstruct your your economy system, your house or whatever. You're going to construct it. And as you reconstruct it, you're going to build back better. All of these people right now involved in this pandemic are the same people sponsored through and from and around the United Nations that sponsored the global warming alarmism debacle that we've seen for the last 15, 20 years. Same people, same universities, same types of computer models that are being used to scare the pants off everybody and create a system of fear. In every case, all of it is designed to drive people to one singular solution. There's never a plan B, there's only plan A, and that is sustainable development, which I very strongly believe is, we can call it neo-technocracy, it's historic technocracy on steroids. These are the people now in control. When the pandemic started, I saw the people involved on both sides of this coin. I said, this is fishy. Immediately I knew it was fishy, that something was going on. I wrote that this was the beginning of the coup d'etat of the technocrats of the world. Their number one objective, and I just take this from literature, it's not me saying this, this is what I have seen in the literature. They are saying that, and their main target is the destruction of the economic system as we have known it for the last 150 years. That means capitalism, the monetary system, et cetera, is out. A new system is coming in. It's an otherworldly system. And the United Nations itself, just to tie it into some of our other speakers, the United Nations itself has said that the financial system that will be necessary to support sustainable development, that's technocracy, remember, is the whole area of fintech that we know that they collectively define as fintech. That's a basket of different technologies, including, financial technologies, blockchain, digital currency, the collection of data from every conceivable corner of society. And altogether, fintech is designed to be the financial system to support this new Great Reset, if you will, this new sustainable development economic system. It's very nefarious. I'll warn you. One of my friends, I'm going to close with this. One of my friends that recently passed, unfortunately, her name is Rosa Corey, has spoken formerly extensively in the United States and Europe as well about Agenda 21 and about sustainable development and the plans that they have orchestrated for the entire planet. And she concluded most of her talks that she gave with this statement. And I like this statement because it's just short, a few words, and it really expresses the whole nut of the thing. She says, it is the inventory and control plan for all land, all water, all minerals, all plants, all animals, all construction, all means of production, all food, all energy, all information, and all human beings in the world. That's pretty blunt. This is where this is headed right now, towards scientific dictatorship, if you will. But it's coming on like an express train. Now the second wave is taking place right now. It's all based, of course, on the pandemic idea, fear, and, you do what we tell you to do and everything will be fine. But now the second wave is taking place. The economic destruction is going to be much greater than it was with the first round in in 2020. And I believe we're going to see a repeat. We're going to see more businesses going out of business. We're going to see the monetary system, the old monetary system, flying out of control. And demands will be called for this, the new area of fintech essentially to take over and to control everything from kind of the organic level, if you will. I'm going to stop with that. I know it's a lot to say in a short period of time. And it's new to a lot of people. They just haven't heard these terms before. But I will say that the concept of technocracy is being discussed and talked about more in the world today than it ever has in the past. And that's a good thing. There's more discussion on it. There's more research going into it. There's more visibility and awareness, especially with the pandemic, that this may be exactly what's going on. I suggest that it is. So thank you for your time. I appreciate all of you guys and everything that you're bringing to the table.
Both Mark and Patrick are describing the push for centralization and the extraordinary economic impact it's having. And it's a lot to hear that a global coup d'etat is underway, but it is. And I think it really helps to face it, and it brings the people together who'd like to see something else. The other thing I could say is that if there's anything I've learned by studying the economy over the last 30 years, it's that this central control is very destructive of the economy. And in fact, there is no reason on this planet for poverty. There's no reason this cannot be turned around as an economic matter. If you run an economy with this tight central control, it's hugely destructive. But instead, if you find a way to do a reset, but a reset that ends with human freedom, there's no economic reason why it cannot work. So even though facing the coup is a very difficult thing, be assured that there is no reason we can't do a very different, I'll call it the people's reset. The economic opportunity is there. Freedom is far more productive and successful. So Cash Friday came out of a wonderful meeting we had with Children's Health Defense several weeks ago, and I was talking about the danger of the vaccine passports being adopted in a way that would give tight control to central bank digital currencies. And the wonderful Mary Holland, who will be with us tomorrow, said, I was saying it's very important that we maintain a high cash balances in circulation and we don't go all digital. And Mary said, because, in America, we all know about dressing down on Friday or eating fish on Friday. She said, well, why don't we have a Cash Friday? And everybody in the whole room said, that's great. So what we've asked our networks to doing, and we hope we spread it globally, on Friday, just use cash. Just use cash. Let's see if we can't dramatically increase the use of cash. We also, if you come to Solari, we have a silver and gold payment calculator, because I've said to people, look, just circulate your coins. Let's not buy into an all digital system, because it's when we go all digital that you get these kind of complete controls. So Richard talked a lot about the importance of decentralizing the banking, which is critical. If we can get the number of local banks and credit unions growing dramatically, that's going to be great for a decentralized economy. The more we can do to centralize cash, currency, equity, and economic activity locally, the more powerful transformation we can make in changing these things.
I would say yes. I am a big fan of Professor Werner's work. He does take a scientific approach, and he doesn't follow schools of thought in economics, thankfully, because as he says, Main Street economics is charlatanism. I would add, though, that my concern is not, I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer. And the thing that bothered me, and has bothered me for a long time, and I alluded to it, and I just talked about it in my presentation in front, is the disappearance of the rule of law. And I first noticed this had happened in early 2013. I set up a YouTube channel in 2014 because the disappearance of the rule of law means that the law is no longer top dog, that you now have the rule of man. And that is, I don't think anybody would ever say that realistically that has been, true all along. But the disappearance in 2013 that I'm talking about is the open acknowledgement that there are people who are above the law, and institutions, namely banks, that are above the law, and that they can commit crimes, whatever they want to, and not be prosecuted for, because supposedly to do so would endanger the monetary system and endanger the financial system. And that is a very toxic, a very dangerous notion that elevates banks above ordinary people, and that was bound to have a bad outcome, and we're facing it right now. So what's the remedy for that? If you look at the founding documents of U.S., it's the Declaration of Independence and it's the U.S. Constitution. They're both premised on the rule of law. So when you have gotten rid of the rule of law, in essence, what has happened is that you have reversed the American Revolution. And the only way to get that back, there's been a coup d'etat, and that term has been used any number of times. I fully agree with that. But I agree with it really in the legal sense. That it's really the law now is really just a tool used to oppress people. And I see that very clearly. And I think a lot of people see that very clearly. And what's happened during these lockdowns, they're very draconian. They're very whimsical. They're arbitrary and capricious. They are enforced, at a whim. And they always benefit the billionaire class. And so we are now operating in an environment without the rule of law. And the way to get that back, unfortunately, the only way to get that back, if you read history, is a revolution, the counter-revolution. And Alexander Del Mar, who for my money was probably the greatest monetary historian of all time, said, the American Revolution really wasn't about Lexington and Concord. It was really about the refusal of American colonists to use the Bank of England's monetary system because it was a debt-based system and it was very oppressive. And the revolution really was the colonists' use of their own money. So I think solutions like using cash on Fridays is a major step in the right direction, but we need to make a lot more. I think the more time you spend trying to operate within the metes and bounds of the current system, you're playing into the hands of the criminals who are running that system now. And we need to start thinking about solutions that are outside of the system, like using our own, currencies and creating our own currencies. That happened thousands of times over and over again during the Great Depression. Local communities using their own currencies. And so, like Professor Werner suggests, it's going to have to be small community-based institutions that they're going to be the laboring ore and what's to come. But I think that we're in a very serious trap right now, and there really aren't too many solutions to get out, unfortunately. But solutions like Cash Friday, like I say, that's a step in the right direction. That's really what I have to comment there.
We do need a counter-revolution, in a sense, to try and turn the tide on this globalist onslaught it's in every country. It's not just America. It's not just France. Not just Germany. It's everywhere. That's part of the problem. People in every country need to take action these days and try and do things to push back. One of the things that I've been greatly concerned about as one who is a constitutionalist, I respect and revere the U.S. Constitution as a system of government, is that free speech and the concept which is embedded in the concept of the First Amendment, free speech is absolutely essential, not only just for human progress, kind of in a larger sense, but in any particular group of people. Free speech is what produces ideas, and it produces relationships. It produces wisdom. We have lost this. This is under attack all over the planet, and especially in America, we see it with massive censorship of doctors and medical professionals. Anybody's got anything commonsensical to say, they're shut down before they can even say it. Media's had been taken over. This is a marker of a revolution taking place. Revolutionaries always go after the media first. They take over radio, TV, newspapers, and this has happened in the Bolshevik Revolution all the way up through Rhodesia, Mozambique, so the sub-Saharan African revolutions. It's always the media first. They're going after media right now and the shutting down communication. if we lose the ability to communicate, like we're communicating right now, this is a blessing for sure for a lot of people, but we have the ability to speak our mind openly without fear of shame, rebuttal, censorship, whatever. But let me tell you, the windows are narrowing in every possible venue. And so we have been just kind of actively, and I won't say desperately, but I could say it, okay, we're desperately trying to get people back to where they start open their mouth again with constructive communication in their own communities to restore their belief systems and their ideas into their local communities again. That's why I started Citizens for Free Speech 4 years ago now. And we've, especially since the pandemic hit, our membership now has absolutely exploded. We're well over 30,000 nationwide members in the United States. And people are understanding now more and more, hey, it's up to me. Don't look at the government. Don't look at the president, Congress, anybody else. It's up to us individually now to take a role in restoring and turning this thing around. And it must start at the local level, in my opinion. And I think a lot of the comments we've heard already kind of reinforce that. But in the end of it, it's all based on our ability to communicate with each other. If we lose that ability to communicate, we're really cooked. So this is something we want to hang on to.
So I just have to say, one of the reasons I love participating in Doctors for COVID Ethics is once a week, I get to hear Dr. Palmer's wrap up. And as you can see, it's brilliant and succinct. So what I will say is that health policy is being manipulated to implement a global change in control of the governance and the management system in a way that I think most of us participating in this discussion don't want to see. And that means it comes down to every one of us, both in how we manage our health and how we interact with the health system, and in our pocketbook and our money, how we interact with the financial system. Everything we can do to change and in our day-to-day lives start to send it in a different direction, because the secret that we've been discussing here is there's no reason it has to go this way. And in fact, I used to have a friend who ran for governor of Tennessee, and he said, you think a snowflake is very weak and powerless until you realize enough of them can get together and shut down New York City. So what I would say to you is that if each one of us in our daily lives, in our time, with our attention, with our money, if we shift our money away from supporting the kinds of things that we're watching now, which are so frightening and disturbing, and start to shift our money into people of integrity and institutions of integrity. I had one doctor the other day say, I'm ready to build a whole new world. I said, let's get going. So I think if enough of us make a change, there's a lot that can be done. And I would really recommend everybody check into the Doctors for COVID Ethics website, because you'll get some good sort of scientific information and ideas on what that group is doing. So with that, I want to thank everyone for a wonderful first day, and please join us tomorrow. We have a lot more. We're going to start off, Carol, I don't know if you remember this, with the propaganda matrix. We'll be talking about propaganda.